The last thing my body did in that other life was fold wrong. I remember the smell, first hot rubber and copper, the specific metallic tang of my own blood pooling under my cheek on cold asphalt. I remember the sound after that. Rain ticking on a crushed hood, and somewhere above me, a voice I'd trusted for 2 years saying time's sorry, but I can't let you ruin our future times, like she was declining a dinner invitation. Then nothing. Then everything again. I woke up to a ceiling fan turning too slowly, the smell of my mother's jasmine rice on the stove, and a phone buzzing on the nightstand with a school group chat notification dated 6 months before the national science competition, before the podium, before the theft, before the car. I lay there a long time, listening to the fan click on every third rotation, feeling the thin cotton sheet rough against skin that had, in another version of this year, already turned cold in a hospital morgue drawer. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than the rebirth itself. I flexed my fingers against the mattress, testing whether horror was going to arrive late. It didn't. What arrived instead was something quieter and colder, something that settled into my chest like sediment. Okay, I thought, let's do this properly. I got up, and the floorboards were cool under my bare feet, ordinary and real, and I stood at the window watching gray morning light lay itself across the same cracked sidewalk I'd walked to school every day of my life. A dog barked 2 houses down. A truck's brakes hissed at the corner. All of it mundane, all of it a gift I intended not to waste. By the time I got to school, I already knew what I would say when Mr. Alderman, our physics teacher, tried to assign us into research groups of 4 for the national science competition, the same 4 he'd assigned last time. I could still picture the classroom from that other life. Sunlight through dusty blinds, the specific chalky smell of the whiteboard markers, and 3 faces I'd once called friends. Mr. Alderman clapped his hands at the front of the room, a habit I remembered with an unpleasant jolt, like hearing a song you'd once loved playing from inside a house on fire. All right, everyone, for this year's science fair, groups of 4. I'll assign them based on skill sets, alphabetically balanced. He started reading names off a clipboard. When he got to mine, he paused, smiling like he already knew what he was doing. "Amy a favor. Me and Win, you'll be working with Brooke Calloway, Tyler Simmons, and Jordan Weiss." I heard it before I even turned my head. The specific creak of a chair as someone leaned back, satisfied, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, a perfume note drifting across 3 rows of desks, rose, cloying, expensive, the kind sold in a mall kiosk under a name like Time's Golden Hour. My stomach folded in on itself like a fist closing. That perfume. I would know it anywhere. It was the last thing I'd smelled before the impact, hanging in the wet night air like she'd sprayed it fresh before getting into whatever car had been following me. Brooke Calloway turned around in her seat, blonde hair catching the fluorescent light, and smiled at me with the same warm, easy smile she'd worn for 2 years before she stood on a stage and told 600 people the project was hers alone. "Guess we're stuck together again," she said, laughing lightly, like it was a joke between old friends. "I heard you're basically a genius," she added, propping her chin on her hand. "I'm excited to actually learn something this year." I smiled back. Cold, easy, practiced. I'm sure we'll figure something out. She had no idea what my smile actually meant. Last time, I would have taken it as a compliment. This time, I logged it the way you log a temperature reading data, not affection. "Actually," I said, raising my hand before Mr. Alderman moved on, "I'd rather work independently this year. I have a specific research direction I want to pursue, and group work slowed me down last I caught myself." Last time, times wasn't a sentence I could finish out loud. Slows me down, usually. I focus better solo. The room went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when someone breaks an unspoken rule. Mr. Alderman blinked, clipboard lowering an inch. "Mia, the competition structure requires groups of—" "I'll enter the individual research track," I said. "It exists. I checked the rules already. I hadn't checked them in this life yet, but I remembered them perfectly from the last one. memorized during the 3 sleepless nights I'd spent trying to prove authorship after my code disappeared. Brooke's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes recalculated. I watched it happen, a small muscle tightening at the corner of her mouth. The kind of tell you only notice if you've already watched this exact face lie to a judging panel once before. "Wow," she said lightly, confident. "Focused," I said. "Mr. Alderman, ever the peacekeeper. Ever the man who would later in another timeline stand in front of a judging panel and swear under oath that Brooke's group had shown him consistent, independent progress," sighed and made a note on his clipboard. "I'll allow it. But you'll need to submit a formal individual proposal by Friday." "Already drafted," I said, which was true, because I'd spent that morning writing from memory the same diagnostic AI algorithm that had once taken me 11 months to build and had been stolen from me in 4 minutes flat. At lunch, Tyler Simmons found me by the vending machines, hands shoved in his pockets, sneakers squeaking on linoleum. In the other life, Tyler had been the quiet one, the one who mostly stayed out of it, the one whose face when the truth came out had looked almost as sick as mine. "Hey," he said, "you really going solo?" "Yeah, Brooke's kind of..." He glanced over his shoulder like the words might get back to her through the wall. "She doesn't love being told no." "I've noticed," I said. He studied me for a second too long, like he was trying to place something in my face that hadn't been there before. In this life, we barely knew each other yet, and he had no memory of the group text where he'd once written times. "I don't think this is right times about the project," and then deleted it 4 seconds later. I remembered it. I'd seen the screenshot during the ethics hearing that never actually happened because I was already dead by then. "Good luck," Tyler said finally, and walked off, sneakers squeaking, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of cafeteria grease and the specific unease of a person circling a decision he hadn't made yet. That evening, I sat at my desk with an old external hard drive I'd bought with 3 weeks of babysitting money, the plastic casing already a little warm from the laptop fan, and I began building from a memory 2 lifetimes deep. The exact algorithm that would once win me a national title I never got to hold. I worked offline. No cloud sync, no shared drive, nothing that could be quietly mirrored onto a USB stick in the dead of night. I kept a written research journal in a physical notebook, dated entries in blue ink, timestamps I could later swear to under oath if it ever came to that. I emailed myself encrypted drafts through a throwaway account whose metadata would show, cleanly and irrefutably, exactly when each idea had been born and in whose hands. I was building a paper trail before I'd even built the algorithm. Last time, I'd built the algorithm and trusted people to be decent about it. This time, decency was not a variable I was going to depend on. 3 weeks in, Brooke cornered me outside the library, rose perfume arriving half a second before she did, curling into the back of my throat like something spoiled. "So," she said, leaning against the wall beside me, arms crossed, bracelet chiming softly, a delicate gold thing that had, in another life, been a graduation gift from parents who never knew where the scholarship money that paid for it had really come from. "How's the Times solo project times going?" "Fine," I said. "You know," she said, voice dropping into something almost gentle, "it's kind of sad, honestly, doing all that work alone. No one to celebrate with when it's done. I'll manage. I just think," she said, tilting her head, "science is supposed to be collaborative, sharing ideas, building on each other's strengths." She smiled, and it was the exact same smile from the stage, from the 600 people standing and applauding, from the words, "Times." I developed this project myself. Times echoing off an auditorium ceiling, while my name sat erased from a screen the size of a house. "I appreciate the philosophy," I said. "I'm still doing it alone." She laughed lightly. The sound like glass wind chimes, pretty and completely hollow. "Suit yourself." She walked off, heels clicking a rhythm against the tile that I recognized instantly, the exact cadence of footsteps I'd once heard crossing a stage toward a podium that should have been mine. My hands, resting on the strap of my backpack, did not shake. I noted the rhythm the way you note a suspect's gait in a lineup. Filed it away. 2 nights later, someone tried the door of the robotics lab after hours. I know, because the janitor mentioned it the next morning, casual, unbothered. A door handle jiggled, a shadow that scurried when the motion light kicked on. Nobody thought much of it. I thought about it very carefully indeed, and went home and moved my actual research files onto a second offline drive, hidden inside a shoebox of old birthday cards in my closet, leaving only decoy files half-finished, deliberately flawed, visible on the lab computer I still used for appearances. It was, I told myself, the same principle as staking a goat to draw out a tiger. You don't need to hunt if you're patient enough to let greed do the hunting for you. The bait had to look valuable enough to steal. So I made sure, in every conversation, in every hallway pass, in every offhand comment to Mr. A. Alderman about my real progress. That word traveled quietly, indirectly, exactly the way rumors do among people who think they're being subtle that my project was going to be extraordinary, that it might actually place nationally, that there might, eventually, be a full-ride scholarship attached to it, the same one that in another life had gone to Brooke's name on a stage, while mine sat in a folding chair in the audience, hollowed out. Word does travel that way. By the end of the month, Brooke had started asking Tyler, in that syrupy, careless voice of hers, whether he thought Mia's onto something big. Tyler, to his mild credit, said he didn't know. He was telling something close to the truth. He genuinely didn't know yet how big it was going to get. How big. Or how ugly. I did. I'd lived it once already, in a version of this life where I hadn't known to protect myself. Where I'd trusted the wrong smile and the wrong perfume and paid for it with everything I had, including, eventually, my own body on a wet road at 11 at night. This time, the trap wasn't going to be my trust. It was going to be theirs. 3 weeks before the regional qualifiers, I let something slip. Not the real algorithm, the poisoned one. A version I'd spent 4 careful nights building, seeded with subtly broken math. Diagnostic weightings that looked plausible on the surface but collapsed catastrophically under actual clinical data, references to a dataset that technically existed, but that I had quietly restructured so any outside user pulling from it would get garbage results without realizing it. It was a beautiful, elegant lie, dressed exactly like the truth. I left it on the shared lab computer, in a folder labeled simply Final Draft, Do Not Open Yet, which, if you know anything about teenagers, is roughly the same as writing Please open this immediately. I made sure Brooke saw me minimizing that folder in a hurry when she walked past the lab computer one afternoon, feigning the exact flicker of guilt a person shows when they've been caught hiding something valuable. It wasn't hard. I'd had practice hiding real fear once. Performing fake fear was easier by comparison, almost restful. She didn't say anything. She just smiled that same easy, sweet, rose-scented smile and walked on, heels clicking their familiar rhythm down the hall. I let out a slow breath once she'd turned the corner, and it wasn't relief. It was closer to satisfaction. The quiet, unhurried kind that doesn't need an audience. That night, the lab computer logs would later show someone accessed the shared drive at 11:47 p.m., using a login that belonged to a work-study student who'd left campus by 9. The folder labeled Final Draft, Do Not Open Yet, was copied in its entirety onto an external device. I know this because I built the logging system myself, 3 weeks earlier, quietly, the way you'd install a camera in a house you already suspected was going to be robbed. I didn't need to watch it happen. I only needed to know, eventually, that it had. 2 days after the folder vanished from the shared drive log, moved, copied, gone, Brooke's whole demeanor changed. She started coming to school in clothes that looked like she'd already won something. A new leather jacket, buttery soft, the kind you could smell across a hallway, tanned hide, and factory dye, mixing with that same tired rose perfume. Diamond studs, small but real, caught the light every time she turned her head to make sure people were watching her turn her head. "We should celebrate," she told Jordan Weiss at lunch, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "I think we're actually going to place this year." I sat 2 tables over, peeling an orange, and did not look up. The smell of citrus oil on my fingers was sharp and clean, a small private pleasure I let myself have while I listened to her plan. A party for a discovery that didn't belong to her and wasn't even real. "You've been working that hard?" Jordan asked, and there was something careful in his voice, something that in another life I would have missed entirely. He wasn't a villain. He was a bystander who wanted to believe the people around him were decent. And I understood that impulse better than anyone, because I'd once been him. "Harder than you know," Brooke said, and laughed, and under the table, her knee bounced with the particular nervous energy of someone who has just done something they know is wrong and is trying to convert the guilt into excitement before it curdles. That Friday, she threw a small party at her house, a real house, the kind with a circular driveway and a chandelier visible through the front window from the street, glass teardrops throwing soft gold light across a ceiling that had never once had to worry about a leak. I wasn't invited. I hadn't expected to be. I heard about it Monday morning from 3 different people, each version slightly more embellished than the last, until by third period, the party had apparently included a champagne toast to the future Nobel laureate, which, given what the science actually did, or rather didn't do, given that I'd broken it on purpose, struck me as almost unbearably funny. I built my life instead. Not around revenge. Around ordinary things I'd once been too exhausted and too trusting to notice. A part-time shift at Mr. Hahn's hardware store on 5th Street, where the air always smelled of fresh-cut lumber and machine oil, and where Mr. Hahn, 71 years old with hands like tanned leather, taught me how to cut a key by feel instead of by machine. Because the machine breaks, kid, your hands don't. I liked the weight of the key blanks in my palm, cool brass warming slowly from body heat, the rasp of the file against metal, a small, honest sound with no hidden meaning behind it. I made a friend a real one. This time, not someone circling my research like a vulture in a cardigan. Priya sat next to me in AP Chem, sharp-tongued, unimpressed by anyone's chandelier, and the first time she came over to my apartment, she wrinkled her nose at the smell of instant noodles my mother had left, simmering on the stove, and said, "That smells incredible. Actually, don't let anyone tell you otherwise." And something in my chest that had been braced for 2 lifetimes finally loosened, just slightly, just enough to breathe. We studied on my bed with the window cracked, city noise drifting up a car alarm 2 blocks over, someone's radio playing something with too much bass, the smell of rain starting on hot pavement, petrichor rising off the asphalt, like the world exhaling. It was, in its own unglamorous way, the first time in either life I had felt something close to peace. There was a night, about 6 weeks in, when I almost let myself feel sorry for her. It was raining. Not the violent kind of rain that would later, in memory, always mean tires and asphalt and a stranger's headlights, but the ordinary kind, steady and unremarkable, ticking against the tin awning outside Mr. Hahn's shop while I swept up metal shavings at closing time. Brooke came in out of nowhere, soaked through, her expensive leather jacket gone dark and heavy with water, the smell of wet cowhide sharp and unpleasant, where it had once been buttery and new. She said she needed a key, cut a spare for her father's study. She said, though something in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes told me it wasn't really about the key. "You work here now?" she asked, water dripping off her chin onto the counter. And I noticed, distantly, that her mascara had run in 2 thin gray lines down her cheeks. The first honest thing I'd seen on her face in months. "Couple nights a week," I said, running the blank through the machine, sparks catching gold under the shop's fluorescent light. "Must be nice," she said. "Simple, no pressure." "It's fine." She lingered at the counter longer than a key cutting required, turning the finished blank over in her fingers, And for one strange, suspended second, I thought she might actually say something true, times I know I'm doing something wrong, or times I don't know how to stop now, times some fracture of honesty I could have almost respected. Instead, she just said, "See you around," and walked back out into the rain, heels clicking unevenly on the wet sidewalk, already fading. I stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the rain on the tin awning, the smell of hot metal and machine oil settling around me like something solid and safe. Then I finished sweeping, because pity, I reminded myself, was a debt she'd never once extended to me, and I wasn't going to start paying interest on one she hadn't earned. The first crack in Brooke's celebration showed up 9 days later. She found me by my locker, and this time there was no easy smile. Her eyes were slightly red-rimmed, mascara smudged just faintly at the lower lash line, the kind of smudge that comes from rubbing your eyes at 2 a.m. over a laptop screen that won't stop returning error messages. "The model keeps crashing," she said, without preamble, without pretense of small talk. On the actual clinical data, it worked in the demo, but "That's strange," I said, and meant every syllable of the words while meaning nothing they implied. "You wrote something like this once, right? Before you went solo?" Her voice had an edge now, something pleading dressed up as casual. "If I sent you the error logs, could you just take a look? As a favor." I looked at her for a long moment, up close, under the fluorescent hallway light. I could see the diamond studs a little duller than the first day, one earring slightly crooked, like she'd put it in without checking the mirror. The rose perfume was fainter too, or maybe I was just used to it now, the way you stop smelling smoke in a house that's slowly, quietly burning down around you. "I don't really work on things I don't fully understand," I said. "You'd know your own algorithm's architecture better than I would." Something in her face flickered. Not guilt, not yet. Just the first cold edge of fear, finding a foothold. "Right," she said. "Of course." She turned and walked away, and the click of her heels had lost its rhythm. It stuttered now, uneven, the sound of someone who no longer trusted the ground she was walking on. That night, lying in bed with the window cracked and the city humming faintly outside, I let myself remember, for just a moment, the smell of rain on wet asphalt and copper, the exact weight of a stranger's headlights swinging across my face in the last second before the impact. It came and went in under 2 seconds, the way flashbacks do. Sharp as a paper cut, and then I was just a girl in a bed again, listening to a car alarm 2 streets over, breathing. The regional qualifiers arrived 3 weeks later. Brooke's group submitted their model, confident, rehearsed, the demonstration slide deck glossy and expensive-looking, in the way only stolen work dressed up in someone else's design sense can be. I watched from the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, the plastic seat cold against the backs of my knees, while 3 judges took turns running the model against a small clinical dataset provided on the spot. It failed spectacularly. Not gently, not a soft, forgivable stumble, but a full collapse. Diagnostic output so wildly, dangerously wrong, that one of the judges actually laughed out loud before catching herself and turning it into a cough. "There appear to be some serious errors in the underlying weighting system," the head judge said, not unkindly, flipping through printed error logs with a frown. "Can anyone here walk me through how this variable was derived?" Silence. Brooke's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Tyler stared at his shoes. Jordan's ears had gone a deep, humiliated red. Brooke started, and then stopped, because there was no sentence in the English language that could explain a system she had never actually built. They didn't place. Worse than that, the judges flagged the submission for review, a note in the official record that would follow them into the regional archive, a small permanent asterisk next to their names. Brooke stormed out of the auditorium afterward, heels uneven on the tile, and I watched her go without moving from my seat, orange peel scent still faint on my fingers from lunch, feeling nothing that could honestly be called joy. It was quieter than joy. It was simply confirmation. She didn't quit, though. That was the thing about Brooke I'd underestimated in the last life, and refused to underestimate in this one. She didn't know how to walk away from something once she'd already convinced herself it belonged to her. A week before that, Brooke's mother had actually called my mother. I only know this because my mother told me about it over dinner, stirring her bowl of pho with the particular confusion of a woman who didn't understand why a stranger's mother had phoned her out of nowhere, voice sugar-sweet over the line, asking whether the girls might patch things up and work together properly this time. Like sisters, my mother, who had raised me on hard hours and harder honesty, had simply said she didn't understand what needed patching and hung up politely. She sounded nice, my mother said, frowning slightly into her bowl, steam rising warm off the broth, the smell of star, anise, and charred ginger filling the small kitchen. Is something going on with your project, Con? Nothing I can't handle, I said, and meant it, though I logged the phone call the same way I logged everything else, now a data point, a small tremor before the larger quake. Desperation makes people reach for softer weapons first. A mother's phone call, a plea dressed as diplomacy. It's only when softness fails that people like Brooke's family reach for something sharper. 2 weeks after the regional collapse, my actual research files, the real ones, hidden in a shoebox in my closet, were accessed. Not stolen outright this time. More careful than that. Whoever it was had gotten into my school email account, the throwaway one I used for time-stamped drafts, through what I later learned was a simple password reset exploit, using answers to security questions that anyone who'd known me for 2 years might have guessed. First pet, mother's maiden name, things Brooke had asked me, casually, over shared lunches, back when I still thought casual conversation was just conversation. I found out because the login notification arrived on my real phone at 1:14 a.m., a small blue light blinking in the dark of my bedroom, and the smell of my own fear sweat, suddenly sharp and unfamiliar against the ordinary cotton of my pillowcase. My hands did shake then, just slightly, for the first time since I'd woken up in this second life. Not because I was afraid of losing the project, because for one disorienting second, lying there in the dark, I thought, this is how it started last time. I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and changed every password I owned by sunrise. 3 days later, a lab technician named Walter, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd worked at the school for over a decade, who always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, even though I never once saw him smoke on campus, stopped me in the hallway outside the chem lab, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. Voice low. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but I saw someone in the robotics lab past midnight last Tuesday, on the security footage. I wasn't supposed to be reviewing that footage, technically, but the motion sensor kept tripping and I went to check." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew, the way you already know the ending of a story you've read twice. He hesitated, jaw working, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly, and I could smell the machine oil on his uniform, familiar in a way that made me think of Mr. Hahn's hardware store, of honest work done in the open instead of in the dark. "I could lose my job for saying," he said. "Cameras aren't supposed to be reviewed without administrative sign-off. But it's Brooke Calloway, her and someone else. I couldn't make out who, plugging something into the lab computer. Twice. Do you have a copy?" He looked at me for a long moment, weighing something his pension, probably, or the quiet fear of a man close enough to retirement to have everything to lose and nothing left to prove. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pressed a small USB drive into my palm, the plastic warm from his body heat. "Don't tell anyone where you got it," he said, and walked away fast, like the hallway itself might report him. I stood there, holding the drive, the fluorescent hallway light flickering once overhead, and felt something settle into place with the quiet, satisfying click of a key finally turning in a lock. It was always meant to fit. By the time national qualifiers arrived, I had built a case the way you build a house. Foundation first, then walls, then a roof that couldn't be knocked over by a single gust of wind. I had my original research journal, dated in blue ink across 6 months, each entry time-stamped and witnessed by nobody but myself, and therefore unimpeachable. You cannot forge 6 months of consistent, unremarkable Tuesday night handwriting. I had time-stamped encrypted email drafts sent to myself, server logs proving exactly when each idea had first taken digital form. I had a formal intellectual property filing, submitted quietly through the state's student inventor program 2 months earlier, the kind of paperwork nobody reads until the moment somebody desperately needs it read. I had server access logs from the school's own IT department, subpoenaed nothing, just requested politely and received, showing exactly whose credentials had accessed which files and precisely when. And now I had Walter's USB drive sitting in a locked drawer in my bedroom desk, containing footage of Brooke Calloway's hands on a keyboard that wasn't hers, in a lab she had no late-night authorization to enter. The national competition arrived at the downtown convention center, an enormous glass-walled building that smelled of fresh carpet glue and cold air conditioning, the kind of sterile, expensive smell that always made me think of hospitals and courtrooms in equal measure. 2 projects had been submitted under strikingly, suspiciously similar frameworks, mine and Brooke's groups, resubmitted. After regionals with cosmetic patches that hadn't fixed the underlying poison I'd built into the version she'd stolen, the judges noticed the overlap almost immediately. You couldn't not notice it. The core architecture was identical down to variable. Naming conventions I'd developed myself. Quirks of syntax as personal as a signature. We have 2 submissions here, with what appears to be substantially overlapping methodology, the head judge said into a microphone. Addressing both teams, standing at opposite ends of the stage, under lights hot enough that I could feel them on my skin from 10 feet back, smell the faint ozone tang of the overworked stage lighting rig. We'll need both teams to demonstrate live understanding of the underlying algorithm. Brooke's face, under the stage lights, had none of its old warmth left. Her foundation sat too pale against skin, gone sallow, from what I guessed were weeks of bad sleep. There were faint violet crescents beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully erase, and her hands, when she reached for the microphone, trembled visibly enough that the sound system picked up a faint tremor in her breathing before she even spoke. We developed this over the course of the semester, she said, voice thin. The core insight was, she stopped, started again, stopped again. The silence stretched, ugly and total. 600 people in folding chairs watching a girl fail to explain a discovery she had never actually made. The head judge turned to me. Miss Wynne? I walked to the front of the stage. The lights were hot on my face. The smell of ozone and hot dust from the rig sharp in my nose. And somewhere out in the audience, I could feel Brooke's eyes on me. Wide, uncomprehending, the exact expression of a woman watching the floor open up beneath her feet in real time. I picked up a marker at the whiteboard and wrote the core algorithm from memory. Not the poison version, not the decoy, but the real one, the one that had once, in another life, been stolen from me before I ever got the chance to defend it in front of a room like this one. I explained the diagnostic weighting logic clause by clause, answered 2 follow-up questions about edge case failure handling without hesitation, and set the marker down to a silence that had shifted, subtly, from suspicion to something closer to awe. Miss Calloway, the head judge said quietly, not unkindly, can your team walk us through the same clause? Nobody on that stage could. Jordan stared at his shoes. Tyler's jaw was tight, a muscle working at the hinge of it, and when I caught his eye for half a second, I saw something in his face that hadn't been there in the last life until it was already far too late. The specific look of a person finally deciding, consciously, deliberately, to stop protecting a lie. He asked to speak to me privately during the recess. We stood in a service hallway behind the stage, concrete floor cold through the soles of my shoes. The smell of stale coffee from a nearby vending machine mixing unpleasantly with fresh paint fumes from a wall someone had recently touched up. I need to tell you something, Tyler said, voice low, glancing over his shoulder the same nervous way Walter had. Brooke didn't act alone. She had help getting into the lab, and it wasn't just her idea. Who else? He hesitated, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether loyalty to a group that had never actually protected him was worth more than his own conscience. "Mr. Alderman," he said finally. He gave her the after-hours access code. "I don't know everything, but I know I think her parents have been paying him for private tutoring sessions that never actually happened. I saw an invoice once, on his desk, for way more money than tutoring's worth." Something cold and clean settled into my chest, the specific satisfaction of a puzzle piece finally clicking into a shape you'd already suspected but hadn't yet confirmed. "Would you say that to the judging panel?" Tyler's throat worked. "If it means I get less blame, yeah, I'll say it." "I'm not offering you a deal," I said. "I'm asking if you'll tell the truth." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression cracked open, tired and a little relieved. The way people look when they finally set down something heavy they've been carrying badly for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "I'll tell the truth." That evening, back at my apartment, I found the old email recovered through the IT department's backup server, the one whose access logs I'd already requested weeks earlier for entirely unrelated reasons. It was from Mr. Alderman's account, sent to Brooke's mother 4 months prior. Subject line simply, "Re." Arrangement? The body of it clumsy and unguarded in the way people are clumsy and unguarded when they've never imagined anyone else would ever read their words. As discussed, I'll ensure Brooke's group receives priority access and guidance. Please confirm the second installment by Friday. I read it twice, the laptop screen throwing pale light across my dark bedroom, and felt no triumph. Only the quiet arithmetic of confirmation. One more piece, slotting into a structure that had, by now, become inevitable. The formal hearing took place 2 days later, in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and the particular chemical sharpness of industrial carpet cleaner, fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, the way it always seemed to in rooms where important, uncomfortable things were about to be said out loud. A panel of 5 sat behind a long table. The head judge, 2 representatives from the State Science Education Board, a lawyer retained by the competition's insurance carrier, and, silent and watchful in the corner, a woman from the district's ethics office holding a folder thick enough to suggest she'd already read everything. Metadata was presented first clean, undeniable, timestamps stretching back 6 months, showing every draft of my algorithm born and refined entirely on my own devices, entirely under my own name. Git logs followed. Version history as immutable as a fingerprint. Then the security footage, Walter's grainy nighttime recording projected onto a pull-down screen at the front of the room. Brooke's silhouette unmistakable, even in poor lighting, hands moving over a keyboard that wasn't hers at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Then the email's mine, time-stamped and sent to myself for safekeeping. Mr. Alderman's, clumsy and unguarded, laid out on the projector for 5 adults in suits to read in total silence. Brooke's parents sat in the front row, her mother's diamond ring catching the fluorescent light every time she wrung her hands, a habit I found myself watching with the same detached interest I might give a lab specimen. When the ethics officer mentioned, almost offhandedly, that her father had been investigated years earlier for a similar arrangement in a business dispute inflated invoices, consulting fees that were really bribes dressed up in spreadsheet language, her mother's face went the color of old paper. Brooke herself sat very still through most of it, hands folded in her lap, the diamond studs from that first celebratory week nowhere to be seen. Whatever jewelry she wore today was small, plain, almost apologetic. Her makeup, usually flawless, had a slight unevenness to it. Foundation caked a shade too thick, over eyes that hadn't slept properly in what looked like weeks. When the head judge finally turned to her and asked, plainly, whether she had anything to say, she looked at me, not at the panel, not at her parents, but directly at me, and something in her expression finally, fully cracked. "You knew," she said, voice low, cracking at the edges. The whole time, you knew I was going to take it. Yes, I said. You let me. Yes. Her jaw tightened, something furious and wounded flashing behind her eyes. Why would you do that? Why would you just let it happen? I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought, briefly, of rain on asphalt, of a voice saying "I'm sorry. But I can't let you ruin our future times like an apology could ever undo a death." I thought of 2 years of trust I'd once handed her freely, and the specific, deliberate way she had spent every ounce of it. "Because you were always going to take it," I said. "The only choice I ever had was whether you'd take something real or something I built specifically to destroy you. I chose the second one." The room was very quiet. Somewhere behind me, I heard Tyler exhale, slow and shaky, and I understood that sound better than anyone in that room could have. "That's not fair," Brooke said, and her voice had gone thin, almost childlike. "No," I agreed. "It isn't. It also isn't fair that you had a car follow me home once. But we're not talking about that life. We're talking about this one, and in this one, all I did was let you be exactly who you already were." She didn't have anything left to say to that. Nobody did. The panel's ruling came 3 days later, delivered in a plain white envelope that smelled faintly of the school office's toner cartridge, the paper inside crisp and formal and utterly without mercy. The fraudulent submission was disqualified and formally stricken from all competition records. Brooke, Jordan, and the fourth member, who'd never been more than peripheral, were suspended from all future state-sanctioned academic competitions, a ban that would follow them onto every future application they'd ever fill out. Mr. Alderman was terminated from the district effective immediately. His teaching credential referred to the state board for review. The paper trail of arrangement emails handed over to the district's legal counsel. The case itself, given evidence of a bribe and unauthorized data theft, was referred to local law enforcement for further investigation. Brooke's father, facing renewed scrutiny into his old business dealings now that a pattern had been drawn between 2 separate decades, released a statement to a small local news outlet insisting his daughter was innocent, a victim of academic jealousy and a rigged system. Nobody who had sat in that conference room believed him, and within a week, the story had migrated from local news blogs to a wider regional outlet, the kind of quiet, humiliating exposure that doesn't announce itself with headlines, but simply follows a family everywhere they go afterward. In every search result, every background check, every college admissions office that eventually pulls the same 3 articles before making a decision. I watched a clip of his statement once, late at night, phone screen glowing pale blue in a dark room, his voice smooth and practiced in that particular way of men used to being believed. He stood in front of a brick colonial with 2 flags on the porch, wearing a suit that fit too well for a man who was, by every account I'd since read, badly over-leveraged on a business built on the same kind of quiet theft his daughter had learned at his knee. Halfway through the clip, the interviewer asked, almost offhandedly, whether he had any comment on the earlier business investigation from years prior. His smile didn't move, but his eyes did the exact same recalculating flicker I'd once watched cross his daughter's face outside the library, rose perfume curling into the back of my throat like something spoiled. I turned the phone off before the segment ended. I already knew how it went. Some tells run in families the way jawlines do. The convention center parking lot smelled of hot asphalt and distant thunder. The day the official disqualification letter went out to every regional media contact on the competition's list, and by that evening, the story had picked up a small, sharp momentum of its own. Not because anyone at the competition wanted headlines, but because a bribed teacher and a stolen algorithm made for the kind of clean, ugly narrative that local news outlets are built to carry. Mr. Alderman's face appeared briefly on a segment about district ethics violations, his voice absent, just a still photograph and a chyron reading, "Terminated, pending investigation," and I felt nothing watching it beyond the same flat, arithmetic satisfaction. I'd felt watching the poisoned algorithm fail on stage months earlier. Not joy, just confirmation. Again, that gravity works the way it's supposed to, given enough time. At the rescheduled national finals, held a month later in the same glass-walled convention center, I stood on the same stage, under the same hot lights that smelled faintly of ozone and dust, and delivered my presentation to a panel that listened, this time, without a single question about authorship. I won. First place, a full-ride scholarship to the university research program I'd once dreamed of in another life and never lived to see, and an invitation to intern the following summer at a respected diagnostic research institute whose name I'd once only read in journal citations. Jordan, to his credit, approached me afterward in the lobby. The smell of convention center coffee and fresh floor wax thick in the air, and said simply, "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I told him I appreciated it, and meant it, and left it there. Some apologies don't need forgiveness attached to them. They just need to be said. I saw Brooke once more, weeks later, from a distance, at a strip mall coffee shop near my apartment. She was thinner than I remembered, hair pulled back without its old, careful styling, wearing a barista's apron that smelled, even from several feet away, of burnt espresso and industrial dish soap. She saw me and looked away fast, and I let her. There was nothing left to say that the last conversation hadn't already said better. That summer, I spent most evenings on the fire escape outside my apartment window, a habit I'd picked up sometime in the months after the hearing, when the case had finally closed, and the noise of it had finally quieted into something like normal life. The city smelled different up there, hot tar roofing, baking in late sun, somebody's grill 3 buildings over, the green mineral smell of a thunderstorm building somewhere out past the skyline. I liked sitting with my knees pulled up, listening to pigeons settle on the ledge above me, feeling the metal grating warm and slightly rough under my palms. Priya came by most Fridays with cheap takeout, and we'd split it on the fire escape, laughing about nothing important. And it struck me, more than once, how strange it was that the thing I'd once thought I needed most, the podium, the applause, the 600 people standing to their feet, had never actually been what I was fighting for. What I'd wanted, in the end, was simply to not be erased, to have the truth of what I'd built be allowed to exist in the open, undisputed, unstolen. One evening in late August, my mother came up to sit with us on the fire escape, bringing out a plate of sliced mango, the smell of it sweet and warm against the cooling evening air, and she asked carefully, the way she always asked things that mattered to her, whether I still thought about the accident. She didn't know, of course, that there had been another version of it, a version that finished, but she'd noticed, in the months since the hearing, a kind of quiet caution in me that hadn't used to be there, a habit of checking locks twice, of walking home a specific well-lit route, even when the shorter one would do. Sometimes I told her, which was true, and left it there, because some truths are heavier than a summer evening on a fire escape is built to carry. She squeezed my hand once, her palm warm and slightly rough from years of factory work, and didn't push further. That was its own kind of love, the kind that lets a wound close in its own time, instead of picking at the stitches out of curiosity. I thought, afterward, about the version of me who never got this evening, who never got mango on a fire escape, or Priya's laugh, or the particular ordinary miracle of being 20 feet above a street that wasn't going to hurt her tonight. I thought about how close I'd come, in that other life, to simply accepting the theft, swallowing the humiliation, believing that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping the truth. I understood, now, with a clarity that no longer needed anger to sharpen it, that the peace I'd been keeping back then had never been mine. It had only ever been theirs bought, cheaply, with my silence. I got what I actually wanted, in the end, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone standing to applaud in that specific echoing auditorium sound I remembered from the life before. Just a scholarship letter in the mail, an internship offer with my name spelled correctly on it, and evenings on a fire escape with a friend who liked the smell of my mother's cooking, and a mother beside me who no longer had to wonder, the way she once had in a life she'd never know about, why her daughter had come home crying, with no explanation she could give. Ideas can be copied, work can be stolen, but truth, if you're patient enough to build it properly, always leaves a trail, and eventually, it finds its way home. If you were me, would you have warned her or let her walk straight into it? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from?